My name is Carolyn Hughes. I'm 59 years old and I live in Ashland, Oregon. 3 days ago, I buried my husband and I haven't really sat still since. That morning, I made coffee for two like I always do. I still pour his cup out of habit, and every time I realize what I've done, I feel something shift in my chest. Not break, not explode, just shift like a quiet click in an old house, reminding you the floor is still settling even when no one walks through. Tom and I were married for 35 years. He passed on a Thursday. It feels wrong that I remember the day of the week more than the sound of his last breath. But there was no goodbye, just a stillness, and then an ache that wouldn't let go. I've gotten calls, I've gotten texts. Some say they're sorry, some ask if I need anything. But honestly, the only thing I've really needed was silence. The kind that doesn't need to be filled with words or casseroles. Just space to breathe without everyone watching to see if I cry. I haven't cried much yet. Maybe that part comes later, or maybe it won't come at all. I don't know. What I do know is that this story, the one I'm about to tell, isn't just about grief. It's about waking up, about seeing things I didn't want to see before, about realizing that sometimes the people you raise grow into strangers, and sometimes being a wife and mother for decades can make you forget you were ever someone else first. This story starts in the quiet moments after the chaos. When the flowers have wilted, the guests have left, and the only sound in the house is the ticking of a clock you now hate. This is where I begin. Not as a widow, but as a woman who is starting to remember who she was before everyone else needed her to be something else. Tom was the kind of man who never sat still. Even after dinner, even after the kids were in bed, he'd be in the garage sketching plans or double-checking invoices. He built his company from nothing. I used to joke that he married me with a pickup truck and a promise. And somehow both turned out solid. When we were younger, he'd leave before sunrise and come back after dark covered in sawdust or concrete dust depending on the day. I stayed home. With Ryan, then with Lena, I cooked clean, scheduled playdates, juggled bills, kissed skinned knees, and made sure birthdays were never forgotten. I didn't complain, not really. I figured that's what marriage was, two people holding up opposite ends of the world. Tom provided the bricks. I was the glue, and for a long time I thought the kids saw that. Maybe they did once, maybe they just forgot. When Tom passed, Ryan didn't come to the funeral. His wife's mother had a birthday brunch. That's what he told me, a birthday brunch. I remember staring at the message, rereading it, like maybe I'd misunderstood. But no, he was too busy clinking glasses at a party while I was picking out a burial suit for his father. Lena called the next day. She asked if I'd eaten, but her voice was tight, like she was just working her way through a list. Within minutes, she brought up the house, said it must feel too big now, that maybe I should think about selling. I stood there with the phone to my ear, watching a spider crawl across the kitchen tile, and I couldn't find the words to answer her. In that moment, I realized I wasn't Carolyn the mother, or even Carolyn the grieving wife. I was Carolyn the remaining asset, the variable in the estate equation. They didn't see me. They saw square footage, pension details, and maybe some furniture worth appraising. The thing that stung wasn't that they asked about the house, it was how easily it came to them. Like concern was just a formality before the real agenda unfolded. They didn't ask how I was sleeping, if I'd been able to eat, or how I felt waking up in a bed that used to hold two people and now felt colder than the Oregon winter outside. I raised those kids with every ounce of my strength. I nursed them through fevers, stood on rainy sidelines during soccer games, stayed up folding laundry while they dreamed safe in their beds. I thought all that meant something, that all that love would anchor them. But when Tom was gone, they didn't reach for me. They reached for control. I tried to convince myself they were just grieving differently. That shock shows up in odd ways. But I knew better. I'd felt that distance growing for years. A missed birthday here, a text instead of a visit. But grief strips things bare. It takes off the soft layers and shows you what's underneath. And what I saw was painful. They loved Tom. Of course they did. He was solid, reliable, always had answers. I was the background, the one who made life possible but never demanded a spotlight. I didn't realize that somewhere along the way I'd faded so far back they couldn't see me at all. I used to believe that being dependable would make me unforgettable, that if I held everything together, I'd always have a place in their lives. But now, looking back, maybe all that holding just made it easier for them to let go. They called when it was convenient. They spoke carefully, politely, like they were handling a task. And I smiled into the receiver and said I was doing fine. because telling the truth felt like handing them a burden they had no interest in carrying. There's a silence that grows between people when one side stops looking. And my children, my grown up children, had stopped looking at me long ago. Maybe I let them. Maybe I thought love alone would be enough. But as I stood alone in that house, surrounded by 40 years of memories pressed into the walls, I started to understand something. The world I built for them, it worked. They grew up safe, comfortable, unaware of the cost. But that comfort came with a consequence. They stopped seeing the hands that built it, mine. The night Tom died, I called Ryan right away. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone, let alone get the words out. It rang, and when it finally went to voicemail, I didn't even know what I said. Probably just his name. Maybe the words your father, maybe nothing at all, I don't remember. I called again, straight to voicemail. I sent a text because that was all I had left. Your dad just passed. Please call me. It was the kind of message that should stop someone cold, wherever they were, whatever they were doing. He didn't answer. Not in that moment, not in the next hour. 5 hours later, I got a text, not a call, just a few words on a screen. Sorry, Mom. I was at Diane's mom's birthday party. Just saw this. Call you tomorrow. That was it. That was my son. A grown man whose father had just died, and all he could offer me was a line of text and a promise for tomorrow. A promise that never came, because the next day passed and the phone never rang. I reread his message more times than I want to admit. I stared at it until the letters blurred. I kept thinking maybe I missed something. Maybe there was a kindness tucked between the words. But there wasn't. There was nothing. Just a flat apology and a mention of someone else's cake and candles. Lena was better, but only slightly. She did call. Her voice was soft, practiced, like she'd rehearsed. She said she was thinking of me, that she knew this must be hard. And then right after asking how I was holding up, she said the words that made my chest tighten. She said maybe now would be a good time to think about selling the house. Selling the house. Not where's your head at. Not how's your sleep, not did you eat. Just a smooth segue into real estate, as if the walls. Tom painted the kitchen we remodeled together. The deck he built with his own hands were just square footage on a spreadsheet. I stood in the middle of that same kitchen, the one where I'd spent years packing lunches, frosting birthday cakes, and waiting up for teenagers to sneak home late. And I realized the people I gave my life to didn't see this place as a home. They saw it as property. I didn't cry, not then. Something colder settled in. It wasn't anger, not quite. It was more like absence. Like the part of me that once hoped they'd show up with arms open and eyes full of understanding had finally gone quiet. I looked around the house and saw it the way they probably did. The big staircase, the formal dining room no one used anymore, the garage full of tools they wouldn't know how to name. Every corner held stories, and none of them seemed to matter anymore. The next morning, I made coffee again, poured 2 mugs before I remembered. His sat untouched on the counter next to the faded dish towel he used to toss over his shoulder. I held it for a second, then let it drop. Even grief felt like a performance now, like I was the only one still in the theater, while everyone else had moved on to the next act. I tried to justify it, told myself they were busy, that they didn't know what to say. But people who care show up even when the words aren't perfect, especially then. What I got wasn't distance, it was indifference. That realization hurt more than losing Tom, because Tom loved me. That was never in question, but these kids, the ones I sat beside through math homework and first heartbreaks and high fevers, they didn't see me anymore. Maybe they never really did. I started to understand something in those quiet hours. When love goes unspoken long enough, it doesn't die. It freezes, it calcifies. And in the space where warmth used to live, there's just a cold ache that keeps its shape. Ryan and Lena weren't cruel. They weren't shouting or slamming doors. They were polite, polished, like a pair of lawyers handling an estate, not children, grieving a father or comforting a mother. And that kind of detachment cuts deeper than anger ever could. I think I expected a different kind of pain, the loud, messy kind. But what I got was silence, polite texts, measured calls, conversations that ended before they ever really started. They weren't coming home to hold me. They were circling the house like hawks, waiting to see where the pieces would fall. And in that realization, something shifted inside me. Not a break, a boundary. For the first time in my life, I stopped making excuses for them. I stopped filling in the gaps with hope. I saw the truth for what it was, not dramatic, not explosive, just cold. And I decided that maybe it was time they learned what that coldness felt like when it came from me. The house had never felt so still. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get when the kids leave for college or when your husband takes a weekend trip. This was the kind of quiet that sinks into the floorboards, that lives in the corners of the room and stares back at you, the kind that doesn't move even when you do. I sat at the kitchen table with a full mug of coffee going cold beside me. The cup was old, chipped on the rim with faded blue letters that read "Best Dad Ever." Ryan gave it to Tom when he was 10. I remember because he saved up his allowance to buy it himself and wrapped it in tissue paper covered in baseballs. Now that same mug sat untouched. The boy who gave it had become a man who didn't bother to show up. I looked around and started noticing the little things I'd been avoiding. Tom's jacket was still hanging by the back door. His reading glasses were on the armrest of his chair, one of the lenses smudged. A pair of socks balled up and tucked halfway under the couch, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. For a moment, I let myself believe he was just out on a job site, that he'd come in, kick off his boots, and ask what was for dinner. But the silence told the truth. It always does. I reached for a notepad. I didn't know why. I just needed to write something down. I wrote his name first, then mine, then the word alone, and then I stopped. That word didn't scare me the way it used to. It hurt, sure, but it felt honest, clear. I had been alone for a long time. I just hadn't let myself say it out loud. Tom was gone, but the kind of alone I was feeling didn't start 3 days ago. It had been growing for years, layered under routines and holiday dinners and carefully folded laundry. I'd made peace with being in the background because it kept the peace. I thought if I didn't ask for too much, if I held my tongue and kept the house warm, that would be enough. But enough for who? I remembered the nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays while Tom slept on the couch with the TV humming in the background. The birthdays I organized without help, the appointments I never missed, the dinners I made with the last bit of energy I had. None of that ever got noticed, not really. And I never asked them to notice. I told myself love was quiet, that real mothers don't need thank yous, that holding everything together without complaint was a kind of honor. But now, sitting in this empty house, I wondered if my silence had become a permission slip, a way for them to stop looking, to stop seeing me altogether. I'd made myself small to make room for them, and they filled the space so completely they never thought to look down and ask if I was still there. There was no explosion of anger, no shouting or slamming, just a slow burn that had been waiting for air, the kind of fire that starts in the belly, not the fists, the kind that doesn't want to destroy, it just wants to be seen. I picked up the mug again, held it in both hands like it might say something if I waited long enough. Then I set it down and opened a drawer. Inside was a stack of old notepads, some with scribbled grocery lists, others half full of phone numbers I hadn't called in years. I pulled out the cleanest one and started writing again. Not a to-do list, not plans, just memories. Snapshots of a life I lived behind the scenes. The nights I rocked Ryan through croup, the time Lena's heart was broken, and I sat with her in the dark until morning. All the birthdays Tom missed because of site delays, and how I always made excuses for him. How I became the bridge between them and disappointment. How I was the one who made everything okay. And how they forgot. The pen moved faster than my thoughts, as if my hand had waited years for permission. I wasn't trying to be poetic. I just needed proof. That I'd been here. That I mattered. Halfway through a sentence, I paused. I looked up at the clock. The sound used to comfort me. Now it felt cruel. The tick between seconds felt like footsteps moving farther away from the life I'd known. But underneath the ache, something else had begun to take shape. Not rage, not exactly, more like a boundary. A line being drawn inside me that said no more. No more pretending their distance didn't hurt. No more smoothing over their absence with excuses. No more offering comfort that was never returned. I folded the paper and tucked it into Tom's jacket pocket. It felt right, like a whisper into a space he used to fill. Then I stood and walked into the living room, not because I needed anything, but because I was tired of sitting still. The air had changed. It wasn't warmer, but it wasn't frozen either. Something had shifted just a little, like the house was waiting to see what I'd do next. I wasn't ready to say it out loud, not yet, but in my heart the words were already forming. I've been quiet long enough. The morning Martin arrived, the sky was the kind of gray that seemed to press down on the roof. I'd already made coffee 2 cups out of habit. His stayed warm on the table while mine sat untouched, growing cold next to the unopened envelope I hadn't meant to pour so much meaning into. Martin had been Tom's attorney for years, a quiet man with soft eyes and a voice that never rushed. He greeted me gently with more respect than pity, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted clarity. We sat at the kitchen table, the one where Tom and I had signed mortgage papers, filled out school forms, and talked about retirement like it was some far-off promise. Now, it was the place where everything shifted, where Tom's final words would be delivered without him present. Martin opened his briefcase slowly, carefully, like what was inside deserved reverence. He said Tom had made arrangements not long ago, that he'd been thoughtful, intentional, that everything I was about to hear had been planned with great care. I nodded even though my throat was tight. He started with the basics. The house would stay with me, the life insurance and investments too. I would hold majority ownership of the business, 60%. That part didn't surprise me. Tom and I had built that company together, even if only one of us held the tools. I'd handled the books, made the calls, scheduled deliveries when the kids were small, and money was tighter than we liked to admit. I earned that 60%, but I didn't say it out loud. Then came the rest. 2 irrevocable trusts, one for Ryan, one for Lena. They'd each receive them when they turned 40. Ryan still had a few years, Lena just a few weeks away. It was enough to buy a house, put a kid through college, more than most people ever see at once. I felt something tighten in my chest, not jealousy, not anger, something sharper, like realizing you've been cut only after you see the blood. I didn't know he'd done that. Tom never mentioned it, not even once in all our late-night talks, all our quiet drives home. He'd planned to surprise them. Martin said it like it was a kindness, like Tom had wanted to give them something they didn't expect. But I sat there thinking they didn't earn this. They didn't even show up. They didn't say goodbye. And yet he still gave. Martin hesitated again. There was more. He reached back into the briefcase and pulled out 3 envelopes. Each one was sealed, my name written on the top in Tom's handwriting. Familiar, slanted, a little rushed. Like always. He placed them gently on the table and didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I stared at mine. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But even before opening it, I knew something had changed. Tom had seen what I was only beginning to admit. He'd known about the distance, about the silence, about the way our children had stopped showing up except when there was something to gain. Maybe that's why he wrote those letters. Maybe he knew I'd need something to hold on to when everything else felt like a transaction. I thanked Martin quietly, walked him to the door. When it closed behind him, the house felt heavier than it had that morning. I stood in the hallway for a long time, the envelope in one hand and a coffee I didn't want in the other. Tom's voice was in the walls, in the smell of cedar that still lingered from his last project, in the photograph by the stairs where he was laughing, eyes squinting, arms around both kids when they still needed us. He left them something generous, maybe more than they deserved. And he left me something different, a choice. To keep going the way I had, quiet, soft, unseen, or to start drawing lines for the first time, with ink that didn't wash away. That envelope sat on the table the rest of the day. I didn't touch it again, but just knowing it was there, it changed something. I wasn't ready to read it, but I knew it was going to say what Tom could never bring himself to say out loud. I see you. I see what they've become, and I trust you to do what I couldn't. I waited until the house was dark before I opened the letter. I sat at the kitchen table where Tom used to drink his late-night tea, the envelope in my hands trembling like it held something alive. The air around me felt heavy and still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. His handwriting reached up from the page like a voice I hadn't heard in days but knew by heart. My dearest Carolyn. Just those 3 words made my throat close. I read slowly, afraid if I rushed it, I'd lose something too precious to replace. He started with an apology. He said he never meant to leave me alone like this, that it wasn't how he planned things, that if there was any mercy in it, he hoped it was that I didn't see him fall. I didn't, but that didn't make it easier. He told me he knew I'd be holding everything together, that it was what I always did, but he asked me not to. Not this time. He said, don't survive this, Carolyn. Live through it. I stopped reading, just for a second. Those words hit something raw in me. Live through it, as if he knew I'd want to disappear, as if he knew I'd start shrinking again, trying to make space for everyone else's expectations. He told me I had given everything, that I'd raised our children with a softness they didn't even know they relied on, that I had been the keeper of birthdays, of quiet comforts, of things that don't show up in bank statements but are the backbone of a life. And then he said something that made my heart break, in a way I wasn't expecting. He wrote, "I think we love them too well. Maybe too gently, maybe we made it too easy for them to forget where it all came from." I had to put the letter down. I pressed it against my chest and let the tears come. Not loud, not desperate, just steady, like the drip of rain against the roof when the storm's already passed. When I kept reading, he told me not to let them take anything more from me. Not the house, not the company, not the memory of who we were. And then in the softest line on the page, he said, "Not you. Not you." I read that line again and again, because that's what I'd let happen. Over the years, little by little, I'd let pieces of myself be taken. To keep the peace, to make holidays run smoothly, to protect their image of a perfect life. But in doing that, I disappeared. Tom saw it, even when I didn't. He said he left the trust because he hoped the money would help, but that it didn't mean he wasn't disappointed, that he had hoped for better, that watching them pull away had been the hardest part of his later years, and that he knew I'd be the one left to deal with it all. He asked me to be firm, not out of bitterness, but out of truth. Because love without truth, he said, isn't love at all. It's something softer, something that breaks under pressure. At the end of the letter, he told me something I hadn't heard in years, but always needed to. He said, "You were never just holding it together. You were holding us up." That line made me cry in a way I hadn't since he died. Not because it hurt, but because it finally healed something I didn't even know was broken. When I finished the letter, I didn't fold it right away. I let it sit open on the table while I stared out the window at the dark. I thought about all the times I stayed silent, the times I smiled through disappointment, the times I let love mean less than it deserved to. But not anymore. That night, I didn't go to bed with grief wrapped around me. I went with something else, a kind of fire, a quiet resolve, like something deep inside me had finally woken up after years of sleep. Tom's letter didn't just say goodbye, it gave me back my voice. And I planned to use it. They arrived right on time, not early, not late, just punctual enough to make it clear this was business, not grief. Ryan stepped out of his car looking like he was heading to a meeting. Lena followed behind, clutching her bag like it held documents instead of comfort. Neither of them looked around. Neither paused to take in the front porch or the sound of the wind moving through the pines the way Tom used to. I opened the door before they knocked. I didn't hug them. I didn't ask how they were. I just stepped aside and let them in. They walked through the house like strangers, like guests. Their eyes drifted to the mantel, to the boxes stacked in the hallway, to the envelope still sitting in the center of the kitchen table. Ryan offered a quick smile. Lena looked tired, but not from sadness, from expectation, like she was bracing for paperwork, not emotion. I sat down at the table and waited for them to follow. They did. Ryan cleared his throat. Lena adjusted her sleeves, and I said nothing. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ryan asked how I'd been, his voice soft, polite, like I was a neighbor recovering from a cold. I looked him in the eye and said, "I've been busy. Busy planning your father's funeral, busy meeting with the attorney, busy remembering what it's like to do everything alone." He nodded but didn't apologize. Lena leaned forward and asked about the trust, straight to the point, no hesitation, no apology, just facts. Like her father's death was a preamble to a spreadsheet. I took a breath. Then I said something I hadn't said in years. I said this isn't about money. That froze them. I told them the trusts were real, that they'd get what Tom left behind when the time came, but I also told them something else, that what they stood to lose was bigger than any number printed on a check. Tom didn't build this company for them to inherit like a prize. He built it to carry his name, his values, his sweat, his late nights and aching joints. And they hadn't earned that. Not yet. Ryan shifted. Lena's eyes narrowed, but I didn't stop. I told them they hadn't just skipped a funeral. They had abandoned a man who showed up for every scraped knee, every science fair, every broken heart, and they had done it without flinching. I told them they hadn't just disappointed me. They had made it clear that love to them had a price tag, and I was done paying it. This house, this business, this legacy, it would be protected. By me. Not because I wanted control, but because Tom trusted me with it, and because someone had to remember what it was really worth. Lena asked what that meant, her voice small as if she knew the answer but needed to hear it anyway. It means you get your shares, but you don't get a vote. You get your inheritance, but you don't get my silence anymore. You don't get to pretend this family is intact when you treated it like a transaction. Ryan said that wasn't fair. I said neither was standing by your husband's grave alone. They didn't argue after that. Not really. They just sat there finally quiet. Finally still. Maybe for the first time hearing me. I looked at both of them. I said I still loved them. That would never change, but I would no longer trade my worth for their comfort. If they wanted to be part of this family, they'd have to start over. From scratch. Like their father did when he built this life with his hands. And then I stood up. The conversation was over. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed them an explanation. I didn't feel like the house was slipping through my fingers. I felt solid, clear. They came expecting division. What they got was truth. And the truth was, I wasn't the one who needed to change. They were. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the same one where I'd fixed my hair for Sunday service and wiped away tears after long nights waiting for Tom to come home. My reflection looked familiar, but not the same. There was something steadier now, something less willing to shrink. My hair was still soft at the edges, my face still carried the map of every year I had lived in this house. But behind my eyes was a calm I hadn't known in decades. Not peace exactly, but something close. I touched my cheek almost like I was making sure I was still here. Not just alive, present, awake. The kind of awake that happens after silence has done its work and the noise no longer matters. I walked down the hallway barefoot. The floor creaked the way it always had, but it didn't sound empty anymore. It sounded like mine. The boards remembering each step, each argument, each late-night dance in the kitchen when the kids were still little. Tom's boots were still by the door. I didn't move them. I didn't need to. They didn't anchor me anymore. They were just part of the story I no longer had to carry alone. I opened the windows, let the air in. The pine scent drifted through the house and curled around the corners like a soft welcome. I didn't feel haunted. I felt held. There were still bills to sort, still laundry in the machine, still a grocery list taped to the fridge in my handwriting from last week. But the difference was, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't doing any of it for approval. I was doing it for me. I brewed a single cup of coffee, just one, and when I sat down with it, I didn't feel the absence of another. I felt the quiet bloom of my own company, and it was enough. The sun began to warm the edge of the kitchen table. Light spilled across the wood grain like it belonged there. I watched it move and didn't rush. I had nowhere to be but here. Later, maybe I'd clear out the old sewing room, or maybe not. The urgency had gone. What remained was mine to shape. I didn't need a ceremony to mark the change, no grand declaration, just the simple truth that I was no longer living around other people's lives. I was living my own. And somehow that was more than enough. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I want you to know you're not alone. If you've poured yourself into everyone else's comfort only to be left behind when it mattered most, I see you. I've been there. I know what it's like to be the quiet one, the strong one, the one who holds it all together until there's nothing left for herself. Sometimes the hardest part isn't losing someone. It's realizing how much of yourself you gave away without asking anything in return. And when that silence finally breaks, it can feel like starting over. But starting over isn't the same as losing. Sometimes it's the only way to come home to yourself. If this story reminded you of your own strength, or the pieces of you that got buried under years of being needed, I hope you'll hold that feeling close. And if you're ready, I'd love to hear your story too. What have you survived quietly? What parts of you are ready to rise? You can leave a comment if you want, or just sit with it for a while. There's no rush. But if you've ever had to find your voice after years of silence, know this. You are not broken. You are just beginning again. And if you were in my shoes, if you were standing in my kitchen with nothing but your truth left to hold, what would you do?